Well, hey there, students. It's Mr. V. This video will continue off of our line to detail video covering how to transition from basic line and drawing techniques into applying them to drawing details, whether it's like a tree, a rock, an animal, and whatnot. But this one, we're going to focus specifically on detailing organics. We're going to look at the thinking behind and the techniques involved in detailing. So on the left over here, we have a constructive sketch. That would be an underlay sketch of what is going on under the hood in the engine of the drawing over here. And over here on the right, we have the finished sketch involving the detailing process. And you're going to notice it's quite a big leap. The reason why we work in this manner is because it solves a lot of the problems early and frees up our mind to focus more on anatomy and detailing. It would be very, very difficult if we were trying to solve the proportions, solve the perspective, solve the anatomy at the same time as detailing. And for beginners, I found that the results oftentimes are a lot stronger if they're working in this generational process. So the term organic means that it changes, that it is dynamic. Organic means living. Organic means natural, or having relationship with nature. And what is nature but controlled chaos? So organic things, typically you're going to see a lot of curves. You're going to see a lot of symmetry and asymmetry. You're not going to see many straight lines. The opposite of organic would be static, meaning it does not change. It would be non-living or artificial and manufactured. So you could say, again, organic is controlled chaos, but static would be controlled precision. So for architecture and perspective drawings and buildings and such, you would have line work that looks like this, very stiff, very geometric, very architectural. And then over here with line work, you would have very organic, things that have round edges. And so that even translates to the way that we use our line, what kind of techniques that we use. So for example, a static and dead line doesn't do much, even if it changes direction. An organic line does quite a bit. And in general, the more your line does, the more interest your brain will find in it. So for example, this organic line, not only does it change direction, but it also changes thickness and it changes technique. It breaks in some areas. And then it also transitions into different types of techniques. For example, hatching over here. So having this fluid approach where you're not just drawing stiff lines across the board for everything, but having lines that are dynamic, that change, that are fluid, but yet still retain the control and the cohesion that makes it necessary for us to understand what we're looking at. It can be very risky to become very sloppy. And it's also very risky for beginners to become very dead and static when they're really uptight about being, quote unquote, perfect with their artwork. So finding a good balance is very important on this. So knowing that there are two ways to draw your line is essential to detailing. So quick question, what resources do you refer to in the design process to know how to draw certain details? How could you know how to draw certain things? Because if we go back to this creature over here, there is a lot happening, right? We got like wrinkly skin, feathers, bony beaks, a whole lot of anatomy in here. And so where does the artist get this information? And for beginners, especially those who have not really drawn much, this is a major leap. Some beginners only get this stage down, with the constructive forms. How do we make the leap from a simple orb? There's the bell. A simple orb for the eye, and then to actual anatomy for the eye. Let's go ahead. So that would be use of research, photo reference. So for example, if I was going to draw a creature that had elements of fox and also penguin, I would be researching many, many, many different photographs of these animals, not to copy. Okay, in my drawings, there's no copying that happens, and especially with beginners, because that doesn't show any ability or learning in the student. What you need to do is get a good familiarity with the anatomy, have your mind full of understanding of, like, for example, the muzzle of the fox, how does the penguin's beak work, draw them at different angles, and that is the research. And you need that information in your head before you move on to drawing. Otherwise, most students don't progress past this point. They don't have the information to make the leap. And so what do we do from there? Let's talk about what is detailing. Detailing clarifies and it adds more information, actually dramatically more information. Here are two cropped images of that weird looking bird creature that you just saw. And so, for example, in our early construction, you might only have, say, the eyeball, the iris, and the cheek, if we look at just these areas. But if we go back to what the leap does, notice the eyeball is no longer one sphere. It's now a top lid. It even has a ridge on the top lid. It's got the eyeball proper. It's got the iris, a socket, a bottom lid, definition in the cheek, wrinkly skin texture on the cheek. So this is tremendously more information than was present. And again, your references will aid you in being able to find that information. But it's up to you to creatively apply it. So there are different kinds of details. I like to call them, for beginners, there are 3 different kinds of details that we're looking at on here. And so the first kind of detail is going to be materials. What is this thing actually made out of? So it has a bony beak. It's got wrinkly skin, right? And so we would need to focus on making it look like a bony beak and making it look like wrinkly skin. Those would be some of the details that we would use. Now, then it comes down to other things that we need to show detail in. So those would be surface changes. Otherwise, our drawing is going to look very flat and sticker-like and dead. So, for example, there's some things you want to think about, for like an attention to the bridge of its nose, showing that this thing is in front of this thing, its cheek behind us. Also, notice how the cheek starts to foreshorten as it curves under. There's detailing showing the 3D form turning away from us. So what is actually happening on the surface? And then another thing that I like to think about when I do creature designs are markings. Now, I didn't really include any markings in here because I wanted my students in class to be able to kind of figure that out on their own by helping me get to that solution. And so a couple of questions that we could ask. Where could we add markings? What kind of markings could they be? And so some students said a scar. We could put scars on it. And that would dramatically show some fun theme and personality and character to this creature. If it has lots of scars, then that would tell us this thing's probably a meat eater, right? Other markings could be like stripes or patterns, like what we characteristically see in nature. Additionally, we could do other types of markings that tell us more about this animal. What if there were tattoos on this creature? That would suggest that it has intelligence, society, culture that it comes from. It's just not a mindless beast. So these types of things you want to be mindful of when you draw. Now then we look at what actual art techniques are used to do the details. And the first is line weight. These are all in contour. Our objective for this assignment is not to use any shading at all. That would be a separate lesson. At this point in the year, I have not taught shading. And it's very easy for beginners to hide behind shading. If we add just an area of darkness over here, that suggests turning a form. But if we have to do it using contour only, that shows that the student really has to understand how this thing is actually working. And so it's very difficult to hide behind, if not impossible to hide behind contour only drawings. And so what are the techniques? So we got line weight. That is whenever some forms overlap, certain areas get a heavier line. Darker areas, where there's less light, that area gets a thicker contour. Then we have creases. That's when 2 surfaces meet. Light usually gets trapped in there. So we get some thicker contour, and those taper out and get thinner as they space out from the original point. And then emphasis points. So the outside of the beak is a selling point in this creature. So also, if the background is making it difficult to see the creature, we would need to use emphasis points around the outside of the drawing to make it stand out. And so the thicker the line draws the attention to that area. So be mindful of line weight is critical. Next techniques that were used in this would be hatching, not as actual shading techniques, but as texture. So for example, in rough areas, hatch can indicate bumpiness. Ridges or small creases can be indicated with hatching. Gentle curvature of form can also be used to suggest hatching, like a soft curved edge as opposed to an abrupt cut line in an image. And then broken line, especially for wrinkly creatures like this, having a contour that starts clean and then fizzles out into kind of a stipple hatch and then transitions back into a contour is a great way to show changes in form, roughness, and texture. So these 3 techniques give students only 3 things they have to worry about, and it simplifies the process down, and generally you can get some pretty strong work just from this alone. So the other one is, where do you put details? How do you know where they go? And we touched on this in the earlier video, but I call them hotspots. And that would be, in further detail, areas that show 3 things. Areas that show function, how something works. Areas that show form. what the form's doing in 3D space, and then areas that are a focal point. Those 3 areas are where you want to target your details. So here's a picture of like a parrot or macaw type of a bird. And let's just look at nature itself and see how it communicates. So areas of form, notice that there's not really much happening up here on the top of the area, in terms of detail work, but it's when things start to curve under and turn away that we start to get definition. So I would add detail work around those areas where a form bulges or curves under. It lets the viewer know that this thing exists in 3D. Also, focal point. The beak is a major selling point for this animal. So I would definitely spend a lot of time putting a lot of information in that region. Changes of form. So when it goes from the head and transitions into these complex shoulder and wing areas, I would definitely focus on that. And then function as well. So I would draw a few of the feathers, mainly in the area where there's the most compressed info. I would not recommend filling the entire thing up with super high-res detailed feathers. It would make the image busy. But I would detail the feathers mostly out here and then still draw the rest of the feathers, but not include as much information in those areas. That way, the focal point gets all the love. Okay, so there's not much happening here. So avoid detail in that area. Give your eye room to rest in the things that you're drawing. It helps the detail stand out if there's area of less detail around it. And then if we just break it down and summarize, I did a quick little contour line sketch of this bird. And so the 3 major areas we focused on is basically what are details, then what techniques are used, and then where do you put them. So details, we've got materials and textures, markings, and surface changes. Contour only techniques, what techniques do we use? Well, we got line weight, broken contour, all over inside the texture work, and then hatch. Hatch worked really well with the feather textures. And then where do we put the details? Areas of foreshortening and form, areas of function, and at focal points, areas that we would need to look at. I would also include this eye had I finished the drawing, but the eye didn't take up too much space and I ran out of time. So those are the major 3 areas you want to focus on when you're detailing. So the process with a constructive drawing method really helps to front load all of this. So students aren't just diving in and working at this level. They've got an underlay where they built a scaffold sketch of basic forms, sculpted that scaffold sketch, and then they use what's called an overlay, which we lay over a clean sheet of paper on top of it, and that is where we do all our detail work, and that's going to be the artwork that we see. And so making that leap from generic shapes to sculpted anatomy is key. A lot of times beginners struggle with that process where they just draw over the shapes and don't include it. And so we're going to take a look at some examples of work that fall into each different category of proficiency. So here would be typical work that would be of the A level, meaning these students, not only they do the work, but they excel in it. They stand out from their peers. They're the uncommon, they're the elite. They are the ones who log in more time than class provides, that study outside of class, that have the passion for it, and you can see it in their work. And so this would be, again, at freshman level in high school. So yes, this would be, really, really good stuff. Jumping down into some pitfalls, areas where students struggle. Typically, let's look at those. And so these would be, if you're doing this for fun, then this doesn't really apply because you're not being assessed to restrictions. But if you want to grow, then do take this into mind. So typically, beginners who struggle with detailing and creature design in general usually have issues with overall simplicity. And that comes down to the presentation, the depth of storytelling, the complexity. Okay. Perspective may not be there. In this lab, we have to use perspective because knowing how things live in 3D and exist in 3D translates to everything. And so students eventually learn there's no difference between a city, a car, a tree, a mountain, an animal. They're all just forms in 3D space. Be careful not to get tripped up by doing jelly bean bodies. Have your designs have complexity in your anatomy. Be very careful with undefined anatomy. So, for example, where do these limbs end? Where do these fins end? Right? Where do these limbs end over here? We need to see what the anatomy, where it starts and where it ends. Flaws in anatomy. Notice how the back leg on this animal is longer than the front leg. Notice there are no joints on it. Major issues we need to be mindful of. Overly simplistic or cliche designs. I usually see beginners just copy different body parts from other animal photos and then You can't really make a unique creature that way if we're just copying pieces of things. That's called plagiarism. And then usually stumpy proportions. That's just because stumpiness comes from a lack of definition in the form development. So usually having very limited anatomy, not that many joints, not very large proportions that work. Right. So let's take a look at these images and see how we could correct them. So if I were a beginner and I was made aware of these flaws, for example, let's talk about anatomy that is non-functional, then I would probably notice that this is a hip and that this leg does not start by growing out of the belly, but that leg would start up here in the hip area. So by having cleanly defined anatomy, we might be able to build up a more successful proportion. Also, if we have anatomy that appears finished. So for example, let's look at these fins over here. They just kind of abruptly end. We would need to think, well, where does the fin come into contact with the surface? What happens in this area of the surface with that fin? And we could find an edge by using hatch strokes. Show where that form ends. We can also use broken line. Right? We could also use cross contour if we needed to, or combine many of the techniques together in order to achieve that. Likewise, when you probably need to think about the rest of the anatomy, clearly there is a mouth here, but there's no just a hole. So what are some things that could happen? We could add a jaw, like it looks like it's got a human-like face. So we could give this thing cheekbones, some kind of a jaw that would be open to show the mouth in action. That could be something that works. And then remember to draw the interior as well. And if it is human-like, it might have lips, it might not. Totally depends. But having this, having perspective, so we shouldn't see flat limbs like this. This suggests that it's paper-like. We would see, or this should be a rounded form. So by having rounded areas, and that should affect the details. So these details, these blobs right here, should follow the curvature of this form, following this line of action. Very simplistic anatomy. Notice how this is just one shape. We should probably see some creases. And if this has an elbow, how does it work? Is it crustacean? Is it lizard-like? In which case we would see some fun definition that would happen here in the form. The student tried to do some broken line going from the edge of the form, but I would actually pull that up a little bit more and add line weight into it as well to show maybe ridges or more ripples and following the curvature of this 3D form. So we do have some segments separating different body parts defined right here. We could have that in this area as well. Kind of like a crustacean has joints that are visible, an exoskeleton around it. And then anatomy, we got to think about these things. The eyes, they're just sitting there. So right here, this line is suggesting that there is a ledge in this area. We probably need some kind of a socket of some kind, rather than just kind of a flat face. So again, studying different types of anatomy, I would say having good attention to what exactly is the specific animal that is being referenced. Is it a predator? Is it prey? In which case, if it's a predator, we'll have eyes in the front, and if prey, we'll have eyes on the side. Finishing anatomy, we should see where these forms come into contact. And how to avoid stumpiness. So there isn't much, this is the typical jelly bean body that we see. So we should have a rib cage using this form. We should have a pelvis, which it looks like we do, and then a belly. Now this animal should also, coming off of the rib cage, have a neck followed by a head. So that neck and head gives it articulation and mobility. I see an attempt to have a neck, but it just kind of grows out of the body. Also, shoulders should be here, but it's growing out of the body. So the limb should start in this region, elbow to forearm to actual foot. So developing the anatomy further would be key. And then lastly, making the leap. This is just an egg shape. and beginners tend to get tripped up in those areas. So defining those forms more clearly. So it's not just an egg shape. For example, remember when we learn the form building technique, the constructive building, working in 1, 2, 3, big, middle, and little. Right now, this is just one big. The student needs to tackle these two areas. So middle would be, maybe we've got a structure right here, and we've got a jaw. Little would be cheekbones, ridges, jaw. And so having this development of anatomy, we can start to create that's kind of scary looking, but we could create something with more development of form in here that gives it more definition, that we could then have more to work with. The less that we have to work with, the more simple your forms, the more difficult it is actually to draw an animal, to have these transitions. Texture work. Work needs to function. So some of these things don't function. For example, how is this animal going to fly? I see that it has a wing, but these wings are consisting of only one type of feather, and the size is a huge issue, so proportions. So you need to go back and study how big are wings relative to the type of animal. And if this is a creature that should be able to fly, then we should be seeing feathers that live on the top of the wing, like this. We should see middle-sized feathers that help with stability, and then larger feathers that provide lift. And even if that wing is not deployed, then we would follow some basic anatomy. There's still a shoulder, there's still an elbow, and there's still a forearm, even if it is collapsed down. So size, you would have to have some wings, even when collapsed, that are going to be probably like this size, pretty darn large, in order to make an animal of this size actually fly. And these wings could be a very beautiful selling point in the image. So, I mean, you could see already that it changes the proportion of the image dramatically if we had some sort of an element like this, and it would be great for storytelling. So, so mindfulness of function, mindfulness of anatomy, proportion, all of these things come together to create a successful creature drawing. So I hope you guys found this helpful, and I look forward to seeing you guys in class. Take care now.